A great player is standing in the paint and a nobody just scored right over the top of him. It happens again the next night, and the night after that. Players he would have swallowed whole a few years earlier are going around him, through him, past him, like he isn't even on the floor. And one night, after a game like that, one of the most feared big men in the history of basketball goes home and cries. Not over a loss, over himself, over the death of the player he used to be, the one he could feel slipping away a little more with every game. Because by the early 1990s, Kevin McHale's body was breaking down, his feet were shot, his game was fading. And in the National Basketball Association, when a beloved veteran gets that old and that slow, there is one thing you are supposed to do with him. You trade him. You cash in on the name while it still means something to somebody, and you get back young players and draft picks before the whole thing collapses to nothing. Every general manager in the league is trained to make that exact move. It is the smart play. It is the cold play. It is the correct play. One man refused to make it. His name was Red Auerbach, the greatest team builder the sport has ever known, and he looked at that broken-down player and did the opposite of what everyone told him to do. He kept him. People called it sentimental. People called it soft. People said the old man was finally letting his heart beat his brain. Some of them are still saying it today. And for a long time, even the player himself wondered if they were right. They weren't. Red was right. Nobody listened. This is the story of Kevin McHale, the greatest low-post technician the game has ever produced, and the coach who understood him better than anyone else ever would. It is a story about loyalty in a business that punishes loyalty. It is a story about a man with 1,000 moves, and the one man who refused to trade him away when every rule in basketball said he should, and by the end you will understand why, decades later, McHale himself finally said out loud what Red had known all along. But to understand why any of it matters, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a frozen mining town in northern Minnesota, where a tall, gangly kid with impossibly long arms was learning a game that would eventually make him immortal. Kevin McHale was born on December 19, 1957, in Hibbing, Minnesota. If you don't know Hibbing, picture the coldest, most working-class place you can imagine, and then make it colder and more working-class. This was Iron Range country, mining country, a place where the ground itself was dug up and shipped off to build the rest of America, and where the people who did the digging didn't have much use for softness or excuses. McHale's father worked the mines. That's the world he came from. That's the world that shaped him, and it shaped him into something strange and wonderful on a basketball court. You have to understand what a place like Hibbing does to a person. This is a town built on the Mesabi Iron Range, a stretch of northern Minnesota that gave up so much iron ore over the years that it helped arm 2 world wars and build a nation's worth of skyscrapers. The men who lived there went down into the earth and came back up covered in the color of the ground. It was dangerous, exhausting, unglamorous labor, the kind that leaves a mark on the body and a certain flint in the personality. Nobody in Hibbing got rich. Nobody in Hibbing expected to. What they had instead was a code, an unspoken agreement about how you carried yourself. You showed up, you did the work, you didn't complain, and you didn't quit, and you didn't think you were better than the man working next to you. That ethic soaked into Kevin McHale before he ever understood it as anything other than the water he swam in. Later, when people marveled at how he could accept a role, how he could subordinate his own enormous talent to the needs of a team, how he could play through pain that would have sidelined lesser men, they were really marveling at Hibbing. They were seeing the Iron Range in him. He never had to be taught that the team came before the individual, because in the world that made him, that was simply how survival worked. You looked out for the guys around you, or the whole operation went under. There was also a stubbornness in him, a refusal to be moved, that came from the same place. Cold, hard, unspectacular places tend to produce people who don't rattle easily. And McHale, for all his easy laughter and his goofy sense of humor, had that unrattleable core underneath. It would define the way he played, the way he handled the end of his career, and the way he understood loyalty when the time came to understand it. By the time he finished at Hibbing High School, McHale had grown into a genuine giant. and he'd led his team to the state championship game and been named Minnesota's Mr. Basketball of 1976. He stayed home for college, playing 4 years at the University of Minnesota, where he averaged over 15 points and better than 8 rebounds a game and set team records that would stand for decades. He was long, he was smart, he had feet that seemed to belong to a much smaller man. And scouts across the country started to notice that this kid could do things in the post that most 7-footers couldn't dream of. But here's the part that gets forgotten. Coming out of Minnesota, McHale was not universally seen as a slam-dunk franchise cornerstone. The consensus top big man in the 1980 draft was Joe Barry Carroll, the All-American center out of Purdue. Carroll had the numbers, the size, the pedigree. He was the safe pick, the obvious pick, the pick that any respectable front office would make with the first selection in the draft. And Red Auerbach did not want Joe Barry Carroll. This is where the legend really begins. Auerbach had gone out to Minnesota during McHale's senior year to see him with his own eyes, and he came away convinced. Not convinced in the loud way, where you tell everybody how much you love a prospect. Convinced in the quiet, calculating Red Auerbach way, where you keep your real opinion to yourself and let everyone else make the mistakes. Publicly, Auerbach talked up Carroll. He let the rest of the league believe that Boston, holding the #1 overall pick, was going to take the Purdue center. Privately, he had zero interest in doing that. He wanted McHale, but he was too shrewd to burn the first overall pick on a player he was certain would still be available a couple of spots later. So Red did the thing that made him a legend. 2 days before the 1980 draft, he made a trade with the Golden State Warriors. Boston sent the #1 overall pick and the #13 pick to Golden State. In return, the Celtics got the #3 overall pick and a young, underappreciated center named Robert Parrish. Read that again because it's almost unfair. Red gave up the first pick and got back the third pick plus a starting caliber Hall of Fame center. He was betting his entire draft on a prediction. He figured Golden State would take Carroll at #1. He figured Utah, picking second, would reach for the hometown hero guard Darrell Griffith. And he figured that would leave Kevin McHale sitting there at #3, waiting for Boston to scoop him up. That is exactly what happened. Golden State took Carroll, Utah took Griffith, and the Celtics, with the pick they had cleverly acquired, called Kevin McHale's name. In one single transaction, Red Auerbach had added Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale to a front court that already featured a second-year forward named Larry Bird. The Big Three was born, and over the next 12 years, that trio would go to 5 NBA Finals and win 3 championships in 1981, 1984, and 1986. So yes, the trade was genius. Everyone agrees on that now. But watch what happens to the story of Kevin McHale from here, because this is where people start to get it wrong. McHale came into the league and did something that would be almost unthinkable for a modern lottery pick. He accepted a role. For the first several years of his career, one of the most gifted offensive big men in basketball history came off the bench. He didn't sulk. He didn't demand a trade. He didn't leak stories to reporters about how he deserved to start. He became the greatest sixth man the league had ever seen, winning back-to-back Sixth Man of the Year awards, and he embraced it. Think about how rare that is. Here was a player who, on most teams in the NBA, would have been the franchise centerpiece. On the Celtics, he was the third or fourth option, checking into the game in the second quarter to torture backup defenders. And he did it because the team was winning, and because winning was the whole point, and because playing for Boston meant something to him that went beyond his own numbers. Compare that to almost any modern lottery pick, and the contrast is jarring. Today, a player with McHale's gifts would arrive in the league expecting a starring role from day one, and if he didn't get it, you'd hear about it. There'd be agents making phone calls, whispers about a trade request, a whole cottage industry of speculation about whether the young star was being properly featured. That's not a knock on modern players so much as a reflection of how the whole ecosystem has changed. But McHale came from a different world and a different mindset. He measured himself by whether the Celtics won, not by whether he started. And that made him one of the most valuable players in the entire league, precisely because he was willing to be used in whatever way helped the team most. Auerbach, of course, understood exactly what he had. A sixth man of McHale's caliber was a weapon almost impossible to counter. Opposing coaches would grind through the first quarter against Bird and Parrish, and just when their bench units checked in and they thought they might catch their breath, in came a fresh, rested, fully unleashed Kevin McHale to punish whatever second-string defender had the misfortune of drawing the assignment. It broke teams in half. It was a luxury no other franchise could match, and it existed only because a superstar-level talent had swallowed his ego for the good of the group. Red never forgot that. Years later, when it came time to decide McHale's fate, that memory would weigh more than any trade offer ever could. And when he was on the floor, what he did to opponents bordered on cruelty. They called him the torture chamber. They called him the black hole, because when the ball went into him on the low block, it was never coming back out. Dominique Wilkins, one of the greatest scorers of the era, famously called him a man with 1,000 moves. And the terrifying thing about McHale was that he seemed to invent new ones on the spot. The up and under, the step through, the drop step baseline spin. He had a fall-away jumper that he launched from somewhere behind his own head, so high and so soft that it was physically impossible to block. He would back a defender down, plant those enormous feet, and then unleash a sequence of fakes and pivots so precise that grown men, all defensive men, would simply give up and foul him. What made him so impossible was the geometry of him. McHale stood 6'10", but his wingspan made him play like a 7-footer with the coordination of a guard. When he caught the ball on the block and raised it up over his head, it was already higher than most defenders could reach even at the peak of their jump. And then he'd start moving. The genius of his footwork was that every fake was a real threat, so a defender could never commit. If you leaned to stop the drop step, he'd spin baseline. If you sat on the baseline spin, he'd go up and under, ducking the ball beneath your outstretched arms and laying it in on the other side. If you jumped at the pump fake, he'd wait, hanging in the air with impossible patience, and finish after you came down. Bigger, stronger men found themselves reduced to guessing, and against Kevin McHale, guessing meant losing. He reportedly had moves he only ever used once, inventing counters in real time and then filing them away, never showing the same look twice in a single game so that no scout could ever build a book on him. That is a level of improvisational skill that almost nobody in the history of the sport has matched. Big men are supposed to be predictable. McHale was chaos wrapped in fundamentals, and defenders hated every second of it. And the numbers backed up the artistry. In the season from 1986 to 1987, McHale averaged over 26 points a game while shooting an absurd 60.4% from the field, leading the entire league. He became the first player in NBA history to shoot 60% from the floor and 80% from the free throw line in the same season. He made 7 All-Star teams. He was named to 6 All-Defensive teams because those long arms that made his fall-away unblockable also made him a nightmare on the other end. He blocked 9 shots in a single game, twice, a franchise record for a team that had employed Bill Russell. There was also a harder edge to him, a toughness that people sometimes forget when they remember the happy-go-lucky guy with the easy laugh. In Game 4 of the 1984 Finals against the Lakers, with Boston in danger of falling into a 3-1 hole and Los Angeles running its Showtime fast break at will, McHale delivered one of the most notorious hits in Finals history. Kurt Rambis was streaking toward the basket for an easy layup, and McHale caught him in midair and dragged him to the floor with what amounted to a clothesline. Benches cleared. Rambis wanted blood. By his own admission years later, he said he'd have gone to jail for what he wanted to do to McHale in that moment. But there was no ejection, no technical, barely even a whistle by the standards of the day. And the momentum of the entire series flipped. Boston clawed back into that game, won it in overtime, and went on to win the title in 7. That was McHale too, the gentle giant who would put you on your back if the championship was on the line. For most of the 1980s, Kevin McHale was one of the 2 or 3 best power forwards on the planet, a linchpin of the greatest era in Celtics history. And through all of it, Red Auerbach watched over the whole operation like a general watching his most trusted battalion. But time is undefeated. It comes for everyone. And it came for Kevin McHale in the most painful way it can come for a great player. His feet started to betray him. In the 1986 to 1987 season, the very year he put up those monster numbers, McHale broke a bone in his foot, and instead of shutting it down, he kept playing. He played through the injury, played on a foot that should have been in a cast, because the Celtics were chasing another title and he was not going to be the guy who quit on his team. He played 77 of a possible 82 games that year on a broken foot. It was heroic. It was also, in hindsight, the beginning of the end, because a foot that has been broken and played on does not fully recover. It changes how you move. It steals that first fraction of a second of explosiveness that separates a great player from an ordinary one. And slowly, over the seasons that followed, the greatest low-post footwork the game had ever seen began to lose the one thing footwork depends on: the feet. There is a bitter irony in that. McHale's entire game was built on his lower body. The pivots, the drop steps, the ability to establish position and then dance around a defender, all of it flowed up from the ground. A guard who loses a step can compensate with craft and shooting. A big man whose feet betray him loses the very foundation his artistry stood on. The moves were still in his head, every one of them, all 1,000 of them. But the body could no longer execute what the mind still knew. It's the cruelest thing that can happen to a technician, and it happened to McHale in slow, humiliating motion year after year in front of sold-out arenas and national television cameras. And he'd brought it partly on himself, through the most admirable instinct he had. If he'd sat out that broken foot in 1987, if he'd protected his own long-term future the way a self-interested player might have, he'd likely have preserved several more years of prime-level basketball. Instead, he sacrificed his own body on the altar of one more championship push. That's the Hibbing in him again. You don't quit on the guys next to you, even when quitting is the smart, self-preserving move. He gave the Celtics everything, and it cost him the back half of his career. Any honest accounting of Kevin McHale has to reckon with the fact that he was, in a sense, a casualty of his own loyalty, long before Red Auerbach ever had to decide what to do with him. By the early 1990s, Kevin McHale was a different player. The numbers were still respectable. He could still get you buckets on the block because skill and craft don't disappear the way athleticism does. But the dominance was gone. The Celtics, once the terror of the Eastern Conference, were getting bounced in the first round of the playoffs year after year. In 1989, out in the first round. Again in the early 90s. The dynasty was aging all at once, Bird's back was failing, and McHale's feet were finished. And the whole magnificent machine was grinding to a halt. And this is the moment. This is the fork in the road that the whole story has been building toward. Because here is what any competent, ruthless, forward-thinking general manager is supposed to do in that exact situation. You have a beloved veteran star whose body is breaking down, but whose name still carries enormous value around the league. Other teams, contenders, teams one piece away, will still pay a premium for that name, for that pedigree, for that championship experience. The smart play, the cold play, the correct play according to every principle of asset management is to trade him. You sell high on the reputation before the reality catches up to it. You get back young players and draft picks. You don't let a depreciating asset walk out the door for nothing. Red Auerbach knew all of this better than anyone alive. He had built his entire legend on being the coldest, cleverest talent dealer the sport had ever seen. This was the man who fleeced Golden State. This was the man who turned the #1 pick into 2 Hall of Famers. Over the decades, he had traded away popular players, unpopular players, veterans, prospects, whatever the moment demanded. And he had almost always come out ahead. Sentiment was not supposed to be part of Red Auerbach's vocabulary. He was famous for lighting up a victory cigar on the bench before games were even over, a gesture of pure, cold-blooded confidence that infuriated opponents. If anyone on earth understood the value of trading a name before the name faded, it was Red. That's what makes what he did next so remarkable. It would have been one thing for a soft-hearted executive with no track record to keep an aging fan favorite around out of nostalgia. But Red was the opposite of soft. He was the sharpest financial and competitive mind the sport had produced. When a man like that chooses loyalty over leverage, it isn't weakness. It's a deliberate act by someone who has calculated every angle and decided that some things matter more than the angles. And in those twilight years, the opportunity was right there. McHale's reputation was still gold. Red could have moved him, capitalized on that name recognition, and gotten real assets in return to help reload the roster. That's what the situation called for. That's what the league expected. Around the Celtics, there were surely voices, quiet ones and loud ones, suggesting that it was time, that the sentimental thing and the smart thing had finally diverged, and that a great franchise couldn't afford to let sentiment win. Red listened to all of it, and then he said no. He would not trade Kevin McHale, not for picks, not for prospects, not for a chance to get younger and start the rebuild. He looked at a broken-down big man with sore feet and a fading game, and he saw something the trade market couldn't put a price on. He saw one of his guys. He saw a player who had come off the bench without complaint, who had played on a broken foot for the good of the team, who had given the Celtics everything he had for over a decade. And Red decided that a player like that had earned the right to finish where he started. To the outside world, it looked like a mistake. It looked like an aging executive letting loyalty cloud his judgment. In a results business, in a business where the only thing that matters is the next banner, keeping a declining veteran for emotional reasons is exactly the kind of decision that gets picked apart. And it got picked apart. People questioned it then. And people have questioned it since, right up to the present day. Even McHale, for a while, seemed to wonder about it. Because being kept out of loyalty is its own kind of hard. It means staying in the arena long enough to feel yourself fall apart in front of everyone. And that is precisely what happened to him in those final seasons. There is a story McHale has told, and it is one of the most honest and heartbreaking things any great athlete has ever admitted about the end. He talked about matching up night after night against players who, in his prime, he would have eaten alive. Ordinary players, nothing special players. And he described the horror of realizing that these guys were scoring right over the top of him as if he wasn't even there. As if the great Kevin McHale, the torture chamber, the man with 1,000 moves, had become invisible. He said that after one particularly rough night, he went home and he cried. He cried over the loss of that part of himself, the part that had been with him since he was a 13-year-old kid in Hibbing, dreaming on a frozen court. He was mourning the death of the player he used to be while still wearing the uniform. That is the cost of staying. That is the price of being kept. And in those moments, you can understand why someone might have thought Red was wrong to hold on, why it might have seemed kinder, or at least smarter, to have moved him somewhere else years earlier. But here is what the critics missed. Here is what the analytics-minded, asset-maximizing, trade him while you can crowd never understood, and what took decades for the full truth to reveal. The value Red was protecting was never going to show up on a stat sheet or a trade ledger. It wasn't measured in draft picks acquired or salary cap cleared. It was measured in something the modern game has almost completely forgotten how to value. It was measured in what it means to a player, to a franchise, and to a city when a great one gets to begin and end in the same jersey. Kevin McHale played his entire 13-year career for the Boston Celtics. Every single game, every single season. From the day Red predicted he'd fall to number 3, to the day he limped off the floor for the last time in 1993. One uniform. In an era when even the most iconic stars usually end up scattered to some unfamiliar city for a sad final chapter, McHale got to be a Celtic from the first minute to the last. He retired in 1993 after Boston was knocked out by the Charlotte Hornets in the first round. His number 32 was raised to the rafters in 1994, and in 1999 he was enshrined in the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. He got to walk away whole. He got to keep his story intact. And the man who gave him that gift, the man who refused every logical, sensible, cold-blooded reason to send him away, was Red Auerbach. For a long time, that kind of loyalty was easy to take for granted. It was easy to file Red's decision under sentimentality and move on. But the further the game has drifted from that world, the more obvious it has become that Red was seeing something the rest of us were too short-sighted to see. In today's NBA, players change teams the way people change phone plans. Stars force their way out. Franchises trade away legends the second the math stops working. The idea of a superstar spending an entire career in one city, of a front office valuing a man's dignity over a marginal roster upgrade, has become almost extinct. And every time another legend gets shipped off in the final act of his career for a couple of second-round picks, Red Auerbach's decision looks wiser and rarer and more precious. Consider how it plays out now. A legendary player reaches the end, his production slipping, and the franchise that he gave his best years to faces the exact choice Red faced. Almost every time, the modern answer is to move on. Ship him to a contender for a farewell run, or flip him for assets, or simply let him walk in free agency and pocket the cap space. There's a logic to all of it, a spreadsheet that always balances in favor of the transaction. And so we've watched icon after icon spend their final seasons in strange uniforms in unfamiliar cities. Their stories fractured right at the ending, all because the math said so. Fans have grown numb to it. It's just how the business works now, but every one of those departures quietly proves Red's point. Because what gets lost in those trades is impossible to buy back. Once a career is fractured, it stays fractured. There is no draft pick valuable enough to reassemble the thing that a lifetime in one jersey creates. The bond between a player and a city that becomes part of the identity of both. Red understood that the ledger was lying to him. He understood that the most valuable asset on the table was not tradable at all, and that the only way to capture it was to refuse the trade. He wasn't being soft. He was being right about something the sport wouldn't fully appreciate until it had mostly disappeared. And here is the part that closes the loop, the part that makes this more than just a nice story about an old coach's loyalty. Because eventually, Kevin McHale himself came all the way around. The player who once cried over his own decline, who lived through the hardest part of being kept, looked back with the clarity of decades and understood exactly what Red had done for him and exactly what it was worth. McHale has said, in no uncertain terms, that he will always be grateful to Red for not trading him. He has said that it meant the world to him to play his entire career with the Celtics. And he addressed the criticism head-on. He acknowledged that people want to second-guess the decision, that people want to call it a mistake, that the modern basketball mind looks at an aging star kept out of loyalty and sees inefficiency. And McHale's response to all of that was simple and defiant. He loved the fact that Red essentially said, "Forget the smart move, these are my guys." He called it a real honor, the kind of thing you almost never see anymore. That's the vindication. Not a trophy, not a stat, not a highlight. A man looking back across his whole life and telling the world that the decision everyone questioned was the greatest gift he ever received. The critics said Red was letting his heart beat his brain. Kevin McHale, the person who actually lived it, says his heart was the smartest thing about him. Red Auerbach passed away in 2006, and he never got to hear the fullness of that gratitude the way it's been expressed in the years since. But he didn't need to. He'd made the call for reasons he understood completely at the time, reasons that had nothing to do with what looked smart in a newspaper column and everything to do with what was right for a man who had earned it. He backed his guy. He let his guy finish the way champions ought to finish, and he absorbed the criticism for it without ever once explaining himself. Because that was Red, and Red didn't explain himself to anybody. It's a strange thing, being right about a person. It's easy to be right about a trade, because a trade shows its results on a scoreboard and a standings sheet, and eventually everybody can count the championships and agree. But being right about a person, about their worth, about what they've earned, about what loyalty is actually for, that kind of rightness doesn't show up on any sheet. It shows up in the shape of a life. It shows up in a career that stayed whole. It shows up, decades later, in a proud man's voice when he says thank you. He was right about Kevin McHale. Some people still aren't listening, but Kevin McHale is. And these days, when he talks about the coach who refused to let him go, there isn't a trace of doubt left in his voice.